Okay, now that we've talked about the heavyweights, let's talk about what I call the lightweights. Okay? Um, Due to gender and segregation roles of the 1800s, most women and blacks were not allowed to investigate major society problems, and very few were college educated. So we really don't have a lot of people to talk about here, and the people that were there were typically ignored by mainstream USA. It was like this in virtually every scientific discipline. Sociology was no different. First one that we'll look at, though, Harriet Martineau. She was English. She was a very early pioneer in the field of sociology, and she had come over in the early part of the 1900s or 1800s rather, to visit the United States. And Martineau published a book in 1837 based on her observations of life as she traveled throughout the United States. It was amazing. She emphasized the impact that economy and law, trade, population had on society's problems within contemporary society back then. She also examined issues surrounding religion, politics, child rearing, immigration. She wrote about social class differences based on gender and race. Um, a lot of sociological insights. But her early work was largely ignored by sociologists until years after her death, literally in the 20th century. So she did gain importance during the 1850s. Why? Because she translated the works of Auguste Comte into English. So that allowed more people to kind of read up on Comte's work. But as far as her own work, it was largely ignored until many, many years later. Jane Addams. Now, Jane Addams, first American that we've talked about here, in the late 1880s, Addams set up what she called a house for the poor. It's called the Hull House in Chicago, and in fact, the Hull House it still operates today. She offered welfare, educational, and recreational services for the poor in Chicago. She soon began researching in an attempt to find solutions to the problems that those people in poverty had. She published her findings concerning wage levels and sweatshops, child labor, the immigrant experience, living conditions, everything you could imagine about the people in these poor neighborhoods. Now, Addams chose to live with the people who she was actually researching, and she did, day-to-day work with them. So therefore, she's considered more of a social worker than a sociologist. There really, back in the 1800s, there was not a huge differentiation between the two, but as we went throughout the 1900s, by about the mid 1900s, those two fields had kind of separated. Um, Sociologists, for the most part, restrict themselves to theorizing, to doing research, gathering info through scientific methods of research, and then interpreting that data. Social workers then use that information and tend to go out and try and make changes or help try and improve society's conditions. And William Du Bois, otherwise known as Webb Du Bois, uh, again, American. He was an early black sociologist. Now, Du Bois believed that sociologists should try to solve contemporary problems. Well, what more of an issue have we had in this country, especially in the late 1800s, early 19s, than racial prejudice and racial inequality? So that's what he studied. He studied a lot into the black community, and he spoke out about racial inequality. Now, he believed that African Americans had to become politically involved. That was essential to end discrimination, and he worked very hard toward getting blacks full political rights. He's also a founding member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. But again, like Adams, like Harriet Martineau, Du Bois was basically considered an outsider, and most of his work and most of his research was largely ignored. So those three people we kind of talk about, and I kind of refer to them as the lightweights, not because of the lack of quality in their work. Their work was tremendous, but simply because the field of sociology largely ignored them until many, many years later. Okay, let's talk about just a few other general things related to the history, and then we're done here with the history of Soc. If you look at kind of a timeline, 1890s is when colleges began offering courses in sociology. 1895 was when the American Journal of Sociology began being published, and so by the early 1900s, not only that journal, but there were others as well, started communicating to people a variety of the research that was going on around the country and around the world, for that matter. And in one of the more comical points of history here, in 1905, the American Sociological Society was founded. Lester Ward was a big promoter of sociology at the time period in America. He's actually considered the father of American sociology. But the American Sociological Society began. It didn't take them very long. It was about a year until they realized that they had kind of goofed and they might want to change their name. I don't know how many people wanted to be associated with being a member of ASS, so they changed the name to the American Sociological Association, and that's what it is to this day. All right. Most American sociologists came from rural backgrounds. They were generally social workers early on, and they attempted to solve a lot of the social problems created by industrialization and urbanization. Those two things kind of went hand in hand. And those were by far the two biggest issues in the late 1800s, early 1900s in terms of sociology and America. Okay? And I think at that point we are pretty much done with the history of Soc. Now you kind of know where sociology came from, how it came about, and the rest we'll cover in terms of classroom stuff.